Welcome, he says in a booming voice. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the fourth Why Arts Matter panel. This series brings together researchers, artists, and community voices to explore how the arts connect across disciplines and help us navigate personal, social, and global challenges. You didn't know that you'd signed up for that, eh? At its core, Why Arts Matter affirms the arts' vital role in offering creative insight, critical reflection, and new ways of understanding the world. We're grateful to continue this series in the Improv Lab today, a space designed for creative exploration, collaboration, and experimentation. It's a place where ideas come to life, where dialogue sparks innovation, and where the impact of the arts can be felt in real time. It's also important to recognize that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Atawandron and Haudenosaunee people, and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that today this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationships to this land where we learn and work. We commit to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. So, here in this space today, we're excited to explore what the past can tell us with our panelists Cathryn Spence, Rowan Bell, and Paul Barrett, followed by the opportunity for our audience to ask questions. The panel today will explore how artistic, literary, and philosophical inquiry deepens our understanding of historical contexts and social transformations. By connecting economic life in early modern Europe, evolving conceptions of gender and identity, and the role of literature and technology in shaping cultural memory, the discussion examines how different forms of artistic and humanistic expression reveal the moral, emotional, and material dimensions of the past. Together, the panelists consider how reinterpreting historical narratives through feminist philosophy, digital humanities, and archival recovery helps us see the interplay between past and present more clearly. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. It's going to be great. So let me, just before we launch into it, introduce our panelists. First of all, I'm delighted to introduce Cathryn Spence, Dr. Cathryn Spence. Cathryn is Associate Professor in History and a member of the Centre for Scottish Studies at the University of Guelph. She is the author of Women, Credit and Debt in Early Modern Scotland and co-editor of the House Males Taxation book, 1634-6. And furthermore, Gender in Scotland, 1200 to 1800, Place, Faith and Politics, that came out just last year. She's also co-editor for the journal Scottish Archives. Her research interests include gender and urban history, and her current project, which is awesome, funded by a Shirk Insight grant, explores concepts of neighborliness in early modern Edinburgh. Across from me, Rowan Bell. Rowan is an assistant professor of philosophy and sexualities, genders and social change at the University of Guelph. They earned a PhD in philosophy from Syracuse University in 2022. Very broadly, Rowan studies gender as a dimension of social identity and power through the lens of trans, queer, and gender-variant experience. They've published work on social norms and authenticity, the metaphysics of gender, epistemic injustice, and meta-philosophy. Their recent work critiques the theoretical and rhetorical work that we ask the concept gender identity to do, and the ahistorical individualistic nature of public conversations about trans existence. Last and, of course, not least, Dr. Paul Barrett. Paul is an associate professor in the School of Theatre, English, and Creative Writing, and in the Culture and Technology Studies program. He is the author of Blackening Canada, Race, Diaspora, Multiculturalism, and the editor of Future Horizons, Digital Humanities in Canada, and Membering Austin Clarke. He recently co-authored with Sarah Roger the Rutledge Guide to Canadian Literature and Digital Humanities. He's currently working on a book about Canadian literature and discourses of humanism. Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to have you here. So that is more than enough from me. I guess we're going to jump right into the conversation. So I'm going to invite each of you to give a sort of 2-minute overview of the topics we're going to be discussing, and then we will take the conversation from there. So I'm going to start with you, Rowan, if that's okay, and we'll go in this direction.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks to everyone for putting this together and for having me. I'm excited to participate in this. So, as Andrew said, I study feminist philosophy, philosophy of gender. So, like broadly, I sort of trace ideas about gender through the world. One of the core ideas in that area is the idea of just basic social construction. So, the idea that the world and our identities and our bodies and our relationships to one another are constructed and depend on the social world and the way that we build it. So that means that they can be different, right? So social construction means contingency. So not only do they not have to be this way, but they haven't always been this way. So I think sometimes it can be really easy, for me at least, to feel trapped in the current world. You see injustice or oppression or destruction of the environment, and it's easy to feel hopeless, like this is inevitable, as if that's the only way that things can be, because it's the only world that we've experienced. And I think that studying the past can show us why that's wrong, that's not accurate. So not only that, so for two reasons, right? So one is that the way the world is comes from somewhere, the ideas and norms and the way that it develops has a history, and we can trace that history and we can see how it might have developed differently, but also that it has been different, and especially if we can attend to marginalized communities and non-colonial communities and ways in which things that have been ignored by dominant narratives, I think we can see ways in which the way the world is can actually be radically transformed. So studying the past can, I think, help us think about the future in really productive ways, not just in a hypothetical, but in an actual material sense.
Thanks, Rowan. Paul?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think my comments are building on Rowan's a fair bit. So my name is Paul Barrett. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for inviting me to speak. So I work basically in two areas: digital humanities and Canadian literature. So digital humanities, broadly speaking, is the use of technology and computational methods to think about questions that we have often thought about in the humanities, but just using these new methods to think about them a little bit differently. And then Canadian literature, we know, is literatures of Canada, with an approximate 250-year history and so on. And in both of my fields, I think there's a kind of historical turn happening where people are interested in thinking about how did these fields come to be, how are they constituted, and how could they have been constituted differently? And that's in line with kind of what you're describing, and how could we envision these fields differently. So digital humanities has often been thought of as kind of like a techie or nerdy vision of what the humanities does, and has really failed until about 10 years ago to think about questions of power, race, gender, sexuality, and so forth, and is now kind of grappling with that. And so part of my work is looking back into the histories of digital humanities to say, how did this field come to be, and where did those questions get addressed? And then likewise in Canadian literature underwent an upheaval in, say, the past 20 years or so, where people started to investigate the kind of relationship between Canadian colonialism in Canada, nation building, and the literature, to investigate basically, how did this literature justify a particular set of political practices, reading practices, the way we think about books, and so on. What do we mean when we talk about a Canadian book? These kinds of questions. And now's a really interesting time, too, to think about CanLit, because it wasn't so long ago that I think people were saying Canada might be the first post-national nation. And Jan Martel said something like, Canada is the greatest hotel room on earth. You can just kind of come in here and leave. But I think we're now living in a moment of strange, renewed nationalism, which makes me, as a critic of Canadian literature, want to return back to the days of when CanLit was really thinking about nationalism and so on, and say, how were people framing those questions, whose voices were not being heard, what was excluded, and that sort of thing. So this looking back is an important part of understanding the construction of the fields that I work in.
All right. Thank you so much, and as with the other panelists, thanks for inviting me. Really excited to be here and part of this discussion. So my research really centers on early modern Scotland, and particularly urban early modern Scotland. So my first book looked at women's economic roles in 3 Scottish towns, and what attracted me to that was, I think, sort of coming in with these ideas about dominant narratives and how we challenge dominant narratives, is that one of the sort of suppositions that I run up against as an early modern historian is sort of this conventional idea that women were just in the household. They didn't really, quote unquote, do anything in the pre-modern past. And so what I was inspired to do through my PhD work, and then the work that came after, was interrogate that and see if it was actually true. And what I found was that in the debt records of these early modern communities, that women were actually recorded as being engaged in businesses. Now, they are working with their husbands, and they're sort of but they're also working independently. And so that inspired me to sort of think more critically about women's place in the past and sort of how those dominant, as we were talking about, those dominant narratives can be challenged. And that led into my current work, my current project on neighborliness in early modern Edinburgh. And that also goes back to my PhD work and my work that came after that, but it also speaks to the tax roll that I edited with a colleague just over 10 years ago now, because that tax roll for Edinburgh actually leads people sort of up and down every street, every close in that community. And so my questions approaching my current research on neighborhoods and neighborliness is, well, what does that sort of physical record, like how can that be reconstructed? How can we ask new questions from how early modern communities are constituted, the people who make them up, how those people interact with each other, whether that's on a social or an economic or a religious or a sexual level. And I think asking questions like that, not just about sort of a particular group in the town, which we all have to sort of circumscribe our research to a certain extent, just because otherwise it's not manageable. But I think sort of asking those broader questions about what constitutes a neighborhood, what constitutes a neighbor, what constitutes interactions in the pre-modern past, helps to really question what we know about early modern communities, about whose work was valued, about who was valued, about the different positions that people had in society in the pre-modern past. And so I think that when it comes to sort of questioning that, mapping and asking new questions of physical sources is really helpful in that quest.
Thank you all. This is going to be great. So, okay, so I'm going to try and describe a through line from what all three of you have said, and then you guys should feel free to tell me I've got it totally wrong or push the direction of the conversation in different directions. But I mean, there's clearly been an emphasis on identities, and identities understood sort of broadly, so individual, but also cultural, national, maybe neighborhoods, right? So identities and the way in which they're rooted in and constructed in a certain historical and cultural context, right? And the importance of understanding how that works, right? So I think part of your work, Cathryn, is we may make assumptions about, a time which is far from our own, and we may just get that wrong because we're not understanding the context correctly. So, and I think I'd be interested to hear if you think that that applies right now as well, right? It's not just distant places and distant times, but each other, right? Maybe Canadians thinking about Americans or vice versa, right? That we need to understand the context in which these things are created. And then the second aspect of that is that it is created, right? So this is something that you said, Rowan, that it's contingent, that it could have been a different historical circumstance. So these identities are not immutable, but changeable. And I think that opens up a whole bunch of interesting questions about, I guess I want to say how changeable and what can we do to change it and how do we do it in a way that's intentional and thoughtful and not making things worse, and what is the scope for making things better. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about there, I would have said. So that's how I'm hearing what you're laying down. So Cathryn, just to sort of get the conversation going, I'm going to start with you. So do you feel that is part of your project as a historian, is to think about those identities and where they come from and how we could be misunderstanding them because we don't understand the full cultural context?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when it comes to historical records, we have to remember that, each historical record is really one individual's perception of what's happening, whether that's a debt case or a case in a church court record or something like that. So there's always biases. There's always going to be layers to those to that information. There's how the person was presenting themselves in the court. There's how the court clerk chose to record that presentation. So I think that there are definitely layers of identities that that we need to unpack. And you do that by looking at those people and how they present themselves in in as complete a way as possible. So when you think about sort of what were their economic roles, what status might they have had in society, if they're appearing in court, how are they presenting themselves, what courts are they appearing in, what's the context for their sexual history or their sexual reputation, and how does that figure in with how they're perceived by their community. So I think that always have to remember that everyone, I think, has a variety of identities, and it's just depending on how you're perceived by the person who's recording you, or who's making that recording, who is making that record. That tends to become what's perceived as your dominant identity. And I think the fuller picture we can get of a person or an event or a community or a neighborhood or a community, then the better we can talk about other communities, other people in similar contexts.
Yeah, interesting, particularly the idea that everybody has multiple identities sort of at the same time, right, and disentangling those. So, I mean, one of the, I think, virtues of this panel is we've got three different, and on the face of it, quite different disciplines represented, right? So, going to either you, Rowan and Paul, from literature or from philosophy, does that sort of disciplinary approach resonate with you? Do you feel that it's different with your approaches, or is there a commonality here?
Sure. So as you were talking, I was thinking about the research that I'm doing right now on someone named John Norton. And I'll try not to talk for the entire hour about John Norton, but I could. So John Norton is a very complex figure who was born in Scotland in 1780 or so to a Cherokee father and a Scottish mother, who then moves to Upper Canada and becomes part of the military, leaves the military, and basically becomes Joseph Brant's second in command, and then becomes a member of the Mohawk community at Six Nations on the Grand River, and fights in the War of 1812. And what's fascinating about him, many things are fascinating about him, is he writes these two journals. One of which is his journal traveling to the Cherokee territories to meet his matrilineal family. The second is a journal where he travels back to Scotland and England to advocate for the Mohawks with the British colonial government. Basically the Haldimand Grant, if you know anything about that, he's advocating for it to be interpreted properly. And he records these two journals, which are 1,600 pages of his recordings of traveling throughout the Americas, meeting Quakers, indigenous people, lots of indigenous communities, settler communities, all kinds of different people. And then his journal to England, the same thing. He meets the king. He meets all sorts of different people. And this is this rich document that at the outset of Canadian literature, when they were writing the literary history of Canada, the editors knew about this document and thought, this is too messy for us. And it's not included in the literary history of Canada. And so my research is kind of like, what happens if we take John Norton and his writing and see it as not necessarily a foundational text, but a text that unsettles the field of Canadian literature. And the reason I'm tying this in is I think the complexity of his identity was difficult for Canadian editors and Canadian writers at the time. They didn't know what to do with this guy. But his journal is so rich because it reveals the kind of complexity of life on the ground at the time, right? His journal is contradictory. It's kind of fragmentary. He's speaking to diverse and split audiences. He doesn't know what to do with certain things, but that's like really rich for me as a literary critic to think about how the complexity and the contradictions of identity lead to a deeper understanding than to say, well, he was part of the British Army, so he's this, or he was Cherokee, so he's this. So it's a complex text.
That actually, that's really lovely. This actually leads really nicely into something I was thinking about saying too. So like thinking about the complexity of identity and multiple different identities, and how I think there's sometimes a temptation either as a researcher or as a person in the world to try to understand, to like sort of try to flatten, and try to like to simplify that down. So I can understand this person if I can like understand them through this lens. So I've been recently interested in the way that concepts, like public concepts of transness, specifically concepts that have to do with gender identity, do that work for us sometimes. I think sometimes that, if you look at, the sort of genesis of trans studies in the like 70s, 80s, and 90s, you have a lot of folks like Sandy Stone, Susan Stryker, writing about how trans identity is this complex, multifaceted thing, that, you know, we have like, it's not so simple as like going from one thing to another thing. There's all these other elements, there's all these other dimensions to it. And then more recently, I think sometimes in the way we talk about transness publicly, there's this idea that if I can just understand someone's gender identity, or if I can understand my own gender identity, that's the end of the conversation. So I was seeing this quite a bit. You were talking about, Paul, about your sort of like meta methodological study, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit with in sort of philosophy of gender, how there's this like push to, if we can understand gender identity, if we can figure out what gender identity is, then we can fix this thing. And I'm worried about that move, because I think that I think it shows up in other ways in different discourses, but I'm worried about it where it shows up, because I think that like transness is one dimension of like a very like of any multifaceted person or community, but I also think that that sort of like flattening can often turn us away from each other. So I think that, you know, like there's lots of ways of doing gender, there's lots of ways of building gender together, and I think that there's a way that shows up sort of recently that's all about like turning inwards and turning towards me and turning towards myself, and I need to understand myself, and I need to understand what's really deep inside of me. And I don't want to claim that that's not important, but I worry that a hyper focus on like identity is like an individualistic thing, or is like something that's just mine, rather than identity is something that faces other people and is always built together with other people, can be really isolating. And I understand why a lot of trans folks understand themselves that way, because if you're in a context where you're not understood or where people can't make sense of you, you might think that the only truths are inside of you. But I think that just understanding identity is always something that's negotiated with other people, and like historically always has been. Like gender is always a thing that's sort of been built together in groups. I think is really crucial for understanding people in their wholeness, but also just like making sense of what gender is for people.
So how much? So clearly it's complex. Like clearly it's multi-layered. I mean, one of the questions that comes to my mind is the extent to which we can be in control of that, right? So, I mean, at one extreme, maybe a historian, well, hypothetical historian, not you, Cathryn, maybe, but might say, well, look, you're in a historical context, it just gives you your identity, right? And, you know, it is what it is, and it's helpful to understand it and realize its complexity, but it's not the case that you can just choose to have a different identity. And then some of what you're saying, Rowan, and I mean, some of the the John Norton story seems to suggest the other end of the spectrum, which is you can assert an identity and you have that freedom, and maybe you don't even need the cooperation of the people around you. You can just assert that you have an identity of a certain sort. So, I mean, where would you think things fall on that spectrum, and does it vary for example, sexuality versus gender roles, for example? I don't know. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of interesting complexity there, it seems to me. So, tough question. Anybody want to answer it or respond to it? Pick it up.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think I can start briefly by saying that I think one thing I'm really interested in when we ask about this question, so if I'm understanding you right, it's a question about like how much are sort of our identities like collective and not up to us and like outside of us, and how much are they something that we can sort of like assert. So I'm interested in the sort of the idea of assertion, right? So I think that that's really where this question like gets answered. I don't know if I have a like clear answer for it, but I think one thing I've become interested in lately is like both sort of currently and also like historically, that sort of act of saying I am this, or this is me, or this is how I want to be understood, or like, and I think that like, you know, you don't know what's inside of people, right? Like as soon as I don't know what's inside of me, like it's sort of hard to articulate, hard to understand. But I think that moment of like saying this is me is where we can start to think about those things most productively, because that's when it stops being just up to me and just private, and that's where it starts being something that we can understand together. And I think it's interesting in the way that you put the question, where you talked about like the articulation of it, right? And I think that's a really interesting focal point for thinking about this question, which is not an answer, but it's how I've been thinking about it.
I can pick up with sort of the articulation, because certainly in the records that I look at, particularly if we're talking about women, like, your marital status is your identity. You are a wife, you are a widow, or sometimes, and I always get a chuckle out of this, you are a relict of a man. So you're a leftover of a man if you're a widow, or you're a single woman. So I mean, it's tied to marital status, and that's sort of, we see that in the court records. We see that in the tax roll that I've talked about, where all of the women, pretty much all of the women, mentioned, if they're widows, they're listed as relics of their husbands, as sort of leftovers of their husbands. And whereas men tend to be tend to be categorized by their economic position, so their business position. So whatever sort of trade or craft or whatever they tend to follow, that tends to be their identity, and so or I should say the identity that's put on them in the records. And then I think that sort of digging down into those records, that's when you start to see the multiplicity of identities. Like, this woman is not just a widow, not just a wife. She's also like a wine merchant. She's also involved in running a tavern. She's also an employer to, X number of servants, kind of thing. So she is clearly someone in the community who is not that being a wife is necessarily, a bad thing, but she is clearly someone who is more than just a wife. And so I think that when it comes to those sort of multiple identities, I think it might be sort of backwards in history as to what you're describing. Like, you're sort of known as one thing, and that's sort of what, that box that you're put into. And then as historians, what we get to do is sort of break the box apart and see how someone is many things at once.
Yeah, and I would pick up on that with Norton's text, for example. So his journals are really, they're observations about the world, they're reflections on, the Napoleonic Wars or the War of 1812 or, American expansion, British expansion, those kinds of things. But they're also an effort for him to kind of position himself in relation to all these different communities. So he's a different person when he's speaking to Quakers. He's a different person when he's speaking to slave-owning people. He's a different person when he's speaking to Joseph Brant, who, advocates for indigenous freedom and is also a slave-owning person himself. He's a different person in all these different environments. So he's negotiating his identity, and the text becomes a really rich record of seeing that. I'd also add that for me, one of the pleasures of my teaching, I teach CTS 1000, which is the introductory CTS class, which is CTS is basically digital humanities. But when we polled students and we asked them, what do you think of digital humanities? They didn't know what that meant. So culture and technology studies made a lot more sense. So CTS 1000, we have a lot of guest lectures. So Rowan, you came and guest lectured. Deirdre McCorkindale Lawrence Hill came and guest lectured. And I would say in each of the lectures, people are drawing on historical cases or historical evidence to show how kind of received categories of identity are actually much more complex than we imagine in a range of contexts. And, that's cool for me to be able to see, and also great to see how people teach and how they handle these questions in the classroom.
So, what are if we focus on history, what are the lessons that we draw from history? Is it sort of a laboratory of different forms of identity? Is it that simple? Or, so yeah, I'm not putting this question very well, but are there ways that we should be thinking about history that then inform us about today?
I defer to my historian colleague.
Sorry, Cathryn, it was a terrible question. Can you make sense of what I'm thinking about?
No, so I think about, when we use history to think about today, I think that one of the great benefits, and I'm going to sort of pick up on one of the questions that we were very helpfully given in advance to sort of think about when we look at people in the past, sort of how does that help us with today? And I think that one of the great joys of looking at, of examining people in the past and of conducting historical research is that when you add something to the conversation, you make that whole historical picture that much more complete. And I think that we can take those models of making a historical picture more complete, and then hopefully, I would hope as a historian, we can apply them to today and just see how having those sort of multiple identities and that bigger picture makes a richer picture, rather than trying to, like, as you say, maybe flatten things. So I think that would be sort of what I would say.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm sort of inserting myself before Rowan here, but is that partly by seeing the richness of history, we sort of see what's possible. We understand more fully ways in which identities are formed, and identities could be different, the sort of contingency. And is it also by understanding our past, we get a better sense of how our culture and our identities have been created? They're not just arbitrary coming out of nothing, that they have a particular history.
Absolutely. I would say absolutely that, the better we understand history, the better we can understand ourselves, because we can see all of those different motivations that have come together to make us who we are in the present day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not a historian, so I feel a little out of my depth on this point. But I do like my sort of amateurish forays into like queer and trans history, for example, have also taught me something about the problem of translation. So just to like sort of problematize this a bit, I think this came up in the questions we were given as well. The concern about sort of imposing modern ideas onto, like in this sort of search for understanding ourselves and understanding possibilities, there's this problem of like, I'm going to take what I understand and impose and like find what I need in the historical narrative. So lately I've been thinking a lot about the claim that people sometimes make that trans people have always existed or queer people have always existed. And I think there's a sense in which that's true. I think it's true that like someone I might be able to understand is something like my ancestor. Is like gender variance is a really common phenomenon in where there's gender variance. But I also think that applying terms like queer and trans to people in the past is, first of all, those are English terms that arise under a very specific political and social context. And they have a very specific relationship to dominant queerphobic, transphobic ways of constructing the world. And so I feel very much of two minds about those kind of, because I recognize their political utility, right? And it does communicate a really important idea in a really simple way, which I think a lot about rhetoric too, which is a whole, I could talk about that for the entire hour. But I'm worried about this because it's so hard to step outside of one's own context, and both like a research context, like a philosophy way of understanding the world, but also just like a historically grounded and context. I think the only way to actually understand those lessons is to there's things that we can never really fully understand about them. There's ways that we can never really see them, and sort of having a little bit of epistemic humility about like not being able to see the whole picture, I think is one way that's one thing I've been trying to bring to my own research on this subject.
Yeah, I always feel a little bit fraudulent when I engage in historical work because I'm not a historian, but I think there's a really great Sarah Ahmed line where she talks about citation is about understanding why things landed the way they landed and why do we cite the people we cite. And I think that's very important because, when we're citing things, we're reproducing forms of knowledge. And if we're thinking historically about who we cite and why we cite, then that's really important. I'd also add too that in my other world of digital humanities and things like that, we have a real history problem. And that actually has to do with the material of what we work with, because people assume that when you put something on a computer, it lasts forever. But there was a stat going around recently that some large percentage of websites from, say, 2013 are no longer accessible. We were just joking before the panel about a musician who has refused Spotify and refused Tidal and has created a GeoCities site. And most people may not even know what that is, but a GeoCities site is a thing from the past. So when we were working on this Routledge book about Canadian literature and digital humanities, we have one chapter which is kind of the history of digital humanities in Canadian literature, like how the Venn diagrams overlap. And to do a lot of that work, basically we asked somebody, we asked around who has materials, and we were given a Dropbox folder where someone had saved PDFs rather than lose them. But most of what survives in digital humanities are printed materials. So the books that were published, the conference proceedings, a little bit of ephemera, but all those digital projects that were on these kind of bespoke networks and bespoke computers, which are really interesting and really cool, by and large don't exist. I can tell you a long story, which I won't, about a Canadian critic who in the 1960s used 300,000 punch cards to punch 15 Canadian poets into a mainframe computer to understand patterns in the poems. And she created this giant concordance. And that concordance is in my office because that's the only place where I can think of. She said, I don't want this thing anymore. So, that history, I don't know what'll happen when I leave my office.
These are the punch cards. You've got those.
No, I don't have 300,000 punch cards. I have the concordance. The punch cards I'm sure are gone. But that's a real problem to thinking historically about the discipline. What happens when, the network no longer exists? Or, if I gave you a historical digital humanities project on a zip drive, what would you do with that? Right.
Can I just jump in to tell a cool story? So you were talking about things in your office. So I had this amazing thing happen to me when I was hired here, where the year that I was hired, a colleague was retiring, and she was at the end of a very long career in feminist philosophy, and she granted me first right of access to her office books. So she took what she wanted, and then she let me have access. And the thing about academic books, I think, is often a huge amount of them get written, and most of them, like, they might get read a little bit, and then most of them just, I mean, we all have like a stack of, somewhere in our department is a stack of like yellowing books that are free that nobody wants, right? I've seen that in every department I've ever been in. And I sometimes find this a little bit depressing, but I was in this office, and it was this incredible opportunity to see like the work of a lifetime, like in physical form. And I think about that in comparison to like my mess of files on my tablet. And I just thought, like, just being in it, she had the first 16 issues of Hypatia, which I have now. I don't know if anybody knows what Hypatia is. Big deal for me. This is a big deal for me. And I just it was a moment to be able to just like have that relationship across time with somebody I didn't know very well, and like with her body of work. So I was just thinking about like the role of physical media. I don't have anything else smart to say about it, but it was just a cool experience.
But I mean, both of these things seem to me to sort of, to some extent, now call into question the history that I guess I've been, just for this conversation, sort of assuming that we look back. There's the evidence. We do a more subtle job than people before have, and we understand the ways in which the identities are multi-layered and so on. But I mean, what's true now presumably was true in the past. A whole bunch of the stuff that was actually generated that could have been evidence isn't there anymore, and it's difficult for us to not use the conceptual frameworks and the lenses that we have now to look at that evidence, right? So can we still do good history? Yeah, this is a lame question, but can we still do good history in that context, right? I mean, so do we just do the best we can? Is it actually okay to say, well, look, I'm interested in the current notion of somebody being trans, and I find it helpful to look at these examples that are not strictly speaking accurate historical examples, but they work to help me think about the contemporary story I want to tell about trans people. Is that okay, or is that cheating? Sorry, I'm putting you.
No, I was going to say, as the historian on the panel, I would say that I think that's okay. I mean, you do the best you can, and you start, and you ask the questions that you can, and you provide the answers that you can, and maybe you go back later and you revise what those answers are. Because I think, I tell my students, we think about history as something that's been very fixed, and it's sort of like, that's history, that's what happened, that's the facts, but the actual truth is that history is constantly being reinterpreted and reevaluated, and history is constantly changing, and we're asking new questions of it, and in some cases sort of changing how we look at people in the past and how we discuss people in the past. I mean, you bring up trans people, and it is something that's very exciting, particularly in medieval history now. And it's sort of like we used to sort of joke that the early iterations of, say, women's and gender history was like, oh, look, I found a woman, or like they add women and stir kind of thing. So we have these dominant narratives. Well, what happens if we add women in, like, and you just stir them up and you sort of see like what the soup looks like at that point. And I think, when it comes to, and that's sort of kind of maybe what we're seeing with some sort of examples of what we believe, people we believe to be trans people in the past, sort of like, oh, look, we found another one. And it's just, and it's been really, and this is something actually that in my medieval sexuality seminar, it's one of the sort of subjects that we look at. And it's been interesting because there's a case that I've sort of followed through my teaching career. So in 14th century London, there is this prostitute who crops up in the records, and there's only one record related to this person, and it's Eleanor Reichner. And this person presents as a woman, presents as a female prostitute, but she is sexed male. And so there's been a whole bunch of stuff written about her. And what's been really interesting to see is how historians have changed how they've talked about her. So they used to talk about him. And they used to use terms like extremely outdated terms now, like transvestite, a transvestite prostitute in medieval London. And so it's been really interesting now to see those historians go back and say, that was not how I should have talked about that person. They identified as a woman. So in when she is talked about now, she is talked about as a she because that is how she presented herself. Now, of course, the great question is, did she ever even exist, or is this something that was totally made up? Because it's like she's not just not just a prostitute who is sexed as a man, but presents as a woman. But she's also charged with having sex with, members of the church, kind of thing. So there's a whole bunch of really fascinating stuff to unpack there. But I would say that yeah, I don't know that we could ever find like the capital T truth, but we can always be, I think, happy with how we are asking new questions and pushing the boundaries of what we think we knew before.
She sounds like an icon.
Oh, she's amazing. She's amazing. The students always love her. The students always, and there are a couple others, and it's just, and we get into like you were saying, sort of what did people who we would call trans now, how would they have described themselves? Would they have any concept of that? And maybe some would have. I mean, as I say, everyone's an individual in history, so we can't say for sure how everyone would have thought about themselves.
Yeah, I really like that line. Everyone's an individual in history. It makes perfect sense to me. And I have nothing really more to add, except I would say from a Canadian literature perspective, my colleague, Alicia Elliott, new member of the School of Theatre, English and Creative Writing, has a famous line where she says, the trouble with CanLit is that it keeps repeating the same mistakes, right? So it keeps reinforcing a white vision of Canada or not addressing its colonial origins or this kind of thing. And I think she's both right, but to kind of connect with what you were saying earlier, it's also more complex than that, right? Because to look to the past of Canadian literature demonstrates, there's all kinds of examples of racialized writers and Indigenous writers having to force their way into the discussion, being marginalized and being silenced. But the terms of that kind of engagement have always been different. So every case was individual also, right? So whether it's about Lee Miracle trying to have her writing heard or Austin Clarke having his writing understood and heard. It's always been different, but history does demonstrate a pattern of exclusion that's informative to how the discipline has been formed today. And yeah.
So could we now turn to sort of a more contemporary perspective, right? So, I mean, this is obviously oversimple, but I feel like there's a bit of tendency for people to say, well, look, in the past, or maybe in other places, there were these, social constructs which, we don't endorse, and they're arbitrary and contingent. But our society, right? This is sort of the true and natural way in which we should think of gender and sexuality and importance, power, right, and relative to maybe an economic role, right? So. Clearly, part of what this conversation is doing is calling that into question. But I guess, how do we do that in a contemporary setting, right? Do we best do that by illustrating the ways in which things can be different? Is that enough, right? Or are the levers of identity that the disenfranchised can take hold of in order to change how society is structured? I mean, that's a big question, right? But I mean, yeah, if we're thinking about now, we're thinking about the debate about, all the kinds of debate about the ways in which things have gone tragically woke, apparently, right? And, we have to reset, right? Is there a way that we can intervene in that debate using the tools that come from history or from philosophy or from literature or digital humanities?
Sure, I can respond to that. I guess I would ask, what kind of intervention we want to make and where we're talking about, right? I think academics are by and large bad at speaking to people outside of the university. So I think there's some value in trying to understand how to speak to people who are not in universities and speak in ways that they can understand. I know in my own discipline of English, we often, we really love arcane language and ways of speaking that are complex and so on. And I think it's important to speak to people in ways that they get. So that's useful. But in terms of the classroom, I mean, that applies in the classroom too. I find classrooms to be energizing spaces. So I'll have discussions with people who say, oh, well, you're one of these woke people who just wants to program your students. And I laugh and I think, if I could program my students, if that were ever possible, but it's not, classrooms are places of discussion and debate, and I find them to be extremely healthy. And they give, one of the great pleasures of this job is you get to work with younger people and hear what they have to say, and you realize like all this, all the stereotypes of the young people and so on, they're completely false, and young people have lots to say. So if there's a space of intervention that I think is really important, it's in the classroom and allowing people to grapple with these ideas themselves. Anyways, that's how I tend to approach it.
I was just talking to someone earlier today about how annoyed I get about the stereotypes of young people that I sometimes hear from my, not colleagues here, but like you hear from, academics sometimes, that there's this idea that, we were talking a bit about AI before the panel started, and there's a stereotype that like the students are lazy and they're incurious, and I just find that the exact opposite is true. I find that I agree with you that the classroom being an energizing space, and a big part of to your question, Andrew, a big part of my approach to this is to think about the ways. I mean, I think I learn from them a lot too, and I often will sort of, if you sit on one of my big lecture classes, which don't do that. But if you were going to do that, I ask the students a lot of questions, and I ask them, I'll like sort of raise a topic. I'll be like, oh, let's talk about sexuality. What do you think about this? And I'll poll them, and I often will save their responses and look at them later. And I learn a lot from them about like how to talk to them. And I think that to your point, Paul, about speaking the language that people need to hear, and in the classroom, out of the classroom, I think that learning something about where people are and how they're seeing it, and how things, sometimes I think I know, what people are thinking about something, and then I actually talk to them, and it turns out if you actually listen, then they're actually thinking something quite different. And I don't think you can sort of make those interventions, which I think we should be doing, especially I think academics should always sort of be doing this, but especially now. I think you can't really understand how to do that unless you're actually willing to listen and to treat the people you're talking to as intellectual equals and interlocutors rather than just recipients of your knowledge. And so it's such a joy to be able to do that. And I also think University of Guelph students, maybe I'm biased, I think University of Guelph students are excellent in this regard. They're very fun to talk to, very just thoughtful and curious. But I do think that, listening as a part of, maybe this is a question about pedagogy too, but I think that actually listening is a huge part of being able to intervene in those conversations.
And I'll just agree with those excellent points, because I think, like you say, having a conversation is where it's most important, where that change is gonna happen.
So I'm going to, this is perhaps our last little sort of round of discussion before we get to involve the audience, and this in some ways ties those together a little bit, but also this is me being sort of devil's advocate-y, right? So, I mean, I think part of the culture debate we're having now is that yes, maybe it's contingent, maybe it's arbitrary, but your identity is connected to a community, is connected to a culture, so this kind of communitarian idea, and that's important for social solidarity. You need to have some identity. You need to have a national identity or a racial identity or something like that. And if people like us go around encouraging students to pursue, to see more contingency than that, and to choose from options that are not part of the menu that's available if you are a British guy growing up in northwest England or something like that, right? That harms the way in which we're bonded together as citizens and as members of a society. So what do you think about that? I mean, that's a little bit of it's not exactly a denial of this whole idea, but it's basically saying, yeah, that's true. We could have a more nuanced historical, et cetera, view, but we shouldn't, because that just makes people upset and uprooted and all that kind of thing.
So I think this is a good question. I think this is a fair question. I think about this a lot in terms of, again, sort of queer and trans identity, because I think there's a lot of pressure on queer and trans folks to have a sort of unified front, and that we're under attack, right? So we need to this is what it is, and we need to have answers to those sort of intrusive questions. And so I think, again, sort of bracketing the rhetoric question, which is not really a bracketable question for us, but I think thinking about, how to think about the importance of solidarity and the importance of sort of stability and identity. I think for me, understanding identity as something that's built is actually a big part of understanding it as powerful and as being able to do this sort of unifying work. So if there's an identity that's just sort of given to me, whatever it is, whether it's like a particular way of being gendered or a particular way of being, national or whatever, if it's just sort of given to me and I don't have anything to say about it, I don't have any reason to take that up and to sort of fight for it and to like care about it. But if it's something that I can contribute to, if it's something that I can build, then it's something that I can sort of rally behind in a way that, it can actually be meaningful. And so I think that I think that there's a worry about losing that part of it. And I mean, this is a big part of, not to keep talking about my own work, but this is a big part of my recent work about trans community, is I think it's really important to think about not the ways in which this is, this identity has always been true, or this has always been a part of me, this has always been deep down inside of me, but no, how am I building this together? What am I actually making possible in the world for myself and for other people?
I love that answer. Cathryn, John, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in there. Well, I think that people want to belong to a community, and I think they want to work to put that community together, and they want to feel like they're part of that community. I mean, I see this in my own studies when we're talking about sort of guilds and that sort of aspect of community in early modern Scotland. And I think too that there are other sorts of communities as well. Sort of the community that young people build, like servants and that and people like that. So I think that, people, they inherently want to belong to a community. And like you say, they want to work with it, and they want to see their own contributions to it. So I think that, and I do think that that feeds back to what we were talking about with identities, because the community that you're part of makes up a big part of your identity. And it doesn't mean that you can't have sort of a multiplicity of identities, but I do think that people really respond to that idea of being a part of something bigger than themselves.
Yeah, I'm mostly agreeing. I'm completely agreeing, but adding very little. I agree, but I think people also want to understand how those communities are constructed. I think to both your points, I think of this in terms of national identity and the ways in which people identify as Canadian or something else, and I don't think that's by default a bad thing, or that they, it's necessarily, regressive in some sort of way. But I think they want to understand how those identities are constructed, and so they can critique it when necessary, or try to make it do something else when necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. So not just be passive consumers of an identity that's handed to us. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been very, very interesting. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we're about out of time for this conversation, but we do have time for some interaction with the audience. So I'd like to invite people from the audience who have had thoughts, have had questions come up. If you could, do we have mics?
There's a microphone right in.
If you want to hop up and ask the panel, tell us what's in your mind.
Somebody has to go first.
A hero.
Thank you so much for this. Having dabbled in history, but also a passion for literature and work in gender and sexuality, this is like the dream panel for myself, so thank you very much. I'm really curious in all of your talk about identity and how we think about dominant identities made me think about when you get status as a deviant kind of identity. So I'm thinking recently reading Anne Barstow's Witch Craze, where women only had legal status as witches. And then what does that mean for their livelihood, for how they can embody that kind of status that is one kind of legal definition, but also like the subculture and counterculture that's really rich and interesting. It would be the same for early modern kind of figure of the hic mulver. There's so many of these deviant kind of cultures, and I'm thinking deviant in terms of a positive, so Jack Halberstein's, the career out of failure, all that good jazz. But I would love I'd love if you could speak to maybe some of that kind of counterculture, counter-identity idea.
I can sort of speak to it as a historian, and also as someone who is teaching a class on the early modern witch hunts right now. So, which has actually been a lot of fun. That we talk about students who are, really engaged and really sort of just there with you in the classroom, and it has been a very energizing experience. So, I'll just sort of say that those sort of countercultures, I think, in some ways they can be helpful for sort of the dominant identity. I think they sort of provide like a common enemy or a common scapegoat that can sort of help. I think we, again, sort of my specialty being early modern Scotland, we sort of see those we see them as those enemies of God, as they're termed by one Scottish historian, as a rallying point for the wider community. But we can also, on the other side, see that sort of counterculture as a source of power, and particularly for people who may have been marginalized and who may have been on the margins of society and had traditionally very little power. It is an opportunity for them to seize and act powerfully, at least for a time. I mean, again, when we're talking about Scotland, which has quite a high rate of execution, persecution and execution for witches in the early modern period, obviously that's not sort of something where it's a long-term source of power. But I think that, yes, definitely it can be a source of power for people who don't otherwise have power.
I think you've covered it, and I don't have a great deal to say about that. I guess what I think of from my perspective is, even the idea of Canadian literature. I wouldn't use the word deviant in the way you're describing, but I think it's aligned. The idea of Canadian literature is a kind of hegemonic formation of how literature gets put together, and many of the writers that I'm interested in that I study and that are writing today wouldn't think of themselves as Canadian writers. They might think of themselves as Indigenous writers. They might think of themselves as Black writers. They might think of themselves as diasporic writers. But coming within this rubric of the nation wouldn't be how would they think of themselves. So I have a kind of complex relationship with that, where I think, in a way, it's useful to think of those relations because it helps situate this work in relation to the histories of this place and the people who've written about this place. In another way, it's got all this baggage associated with it. So how do you kind of navigate those things? And I don't have an easy answer for that.
This is, I think I have a lot of sort of jumbled thoughts about this, but one thing I do want to say is I've been thinking a lot about how dominant representations of what we might call deviant identity can be like really stereotyping and really distorting, but also how they can be sort of taken up in these resistant ways. And I don't have an answer for the question I'm about to pose, but it's something I've been thinking about, is like, to what extent is that, like, it can be a source of power, it can be a source of joy, it can be a source of resistance to take it up in this like resistant and weird. I was thinking about like camp as an identity, or like the ways in which we can sort of play on these stereotypes. But I guess I'm also worried about like the stickiness of the dominant narrative and how that can like infuse the point of resistance. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I don't think I'm any closer to any kind of resolution. But I think that's a nexus that I found really, really interesting to and really fruitful for thought, is like thinking about the way in which deviance can be both like, again, like you can sort of take up the sort of label of deviance, like you were saying, you can take it up in these resistant, like Jack Halberstam style, who just like also an icon. But also it can sort of bring with it all these worrisome upshots. So again, no answers, only questions. I am a philosopher.
Exactly, classic philosopher. That was a great question. That was very interesting. Other questions or thoughts?
Hey everyone, thanks so much for your panel. It was really enlightening. You talked a lot about interpretations, and I'm wondering if you can study your interpretations of history and learn anything about yourselves or your world or your desires for the present and the future. Thanks.
Sorry, can I clarify? Sure. Do you mean like studying one's own interpretations of history, like sort of being reflexive? Okay.
Exactly, yes.
Thank you. I have to think about that.
Yeah, now you're on the hook to answer it, right?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, I could say something. I mean, I think that's a really good question, actually. I think I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. I'm going to quote Donna Haraway again because you're talking about like a person you could think about, or a particular text you can think about forever. I've been thinking a lot about her situated knowledges recently, and one of the things she says is that like part of being a knower, part of like contributing to the project of seeing things in their wholeness, is like not just having a situation and having a perspective that is important, but like understanding that situation and that perspective and understanding its lens and like what one's relationship is to the thing, and sort of having this meta awareness. I was also thinking of Judith Butler talking about how in giving an account of oneself, they talk about how being sort of marginalized or being like being in a world that's not made for you, or like being a body that's not at home in the world, in Sarah Ahmed's terms. Dropping a lot of names today. But like being that kind of a thing, being a non-normative kind of a body in the world, is always being a social theorist, because you don't get the choice of whether to have to make sense of the social world. The social world doesn't make sense to you, and so you have to sort of make sense of it. So this is a really fruitful question, and I think it can be really illuminating. I also think not doing it is just like not doing the work correctly. I think like if you don't understand something about like what your perspective, like not like the distortion, but like just the lens that you have, you don't understand the pictures you're taking. Is that anything? Yeah, I think that's really important to be able to do. I don't know. Others might have more fruitful things to say.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much. For me, your question makes me think of, I don't know if you know the Ian Williams novel Reproduction, which is set in Brampton in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and then basically contemporary moment. And I was obsessed with this novel because I'm from Brampton, and so I was reading it like at a granular level to say, was that Zellers on that street, and was that place? And there's kind of pleasure in recognition, right? Where you say, oh, I know that. Like, I know that thing so well. And it made me ask myself, what is that pleasure of recognition? That, like, what is my kind of affective response to this text? And, the novel's called Reproduction for a whole bunch of different reasons, but my kind of take on it is that it's reproducing a certain vision of the social, of the world we live in. And it's hard to tell, where critique of some sort begins and where a kind of like, I don't know, aestheticized monumentalism is happening, where you just say, wasn't it so glorious when we all walked through Zeller's aisles, and remember what that felt like? And I felt it because I knew that world. And I think that's an important part of reading. Like when you're reading contemporary work, there's something salient and really important about what it means to read something you recognize, and that helps you see kind of how you read those texts. That's very vague, but yeah.
Yeah, but we all miss Sellers. We all miss Sellers. Part of the Canadian experience. And I think those are two great answers. I don't have really anything to add except that just a quick personal story that I got married during my PhD, and so I was studying these Scottish women, and Scottish women prior to the modern period didn't take their husband's name when they got married, so they maintained their natal surnames their entire lives, although their children do take their names. And that was the reason I did not take my husband's name. I thought, I'm studying these women and I'm going to stand in solidarity with them. And that is also why our children have his name, not mine, although I kind of regret that now. I'm thinking I did all the work. I should have given them my name, but yeah.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, other questions?
So this is building off of the previous question where sort of they mentioned Halberstam and failure. And I'm thinking about everything you've said, especially these sort of robust and thoughtful and exciting things you had to say about being in the classroom, and thinking about the context of why arts matters. So if art itself is a failure, what other ways of being and knowing happen that are counter to sort of the neoliberal university, for example, right? What is it that we do in the classroom that is emblematic of alternative ways of being and knowing that contest and confront dominant narratives and constellations of power and oppression?
Thanks, Jade. I have a really cheesy answer, so in my life in the English and SOTEC department, in the English department. I'm the graduate coordinator. So I speak to a lot of graduate students about and the struggles of graduate studies and how difficult it is. And I have to restrain myself from saying, being a graduate student is a utopian experience, because it is not a utopian experience. I have been a graduate student. I know how hard it is. But there is something about being given that time and being given that space and the freedom to think and to write in these kinds of ways. And in undergraduate classrooms or graduate classrooms, there's a kind of, I hate the phrase meaning making because I don't know what it means, but there is that kind of like a struggling over how our terms are gonna resonate and like what our terms mean. And I think just that time and that wrestling over what language means or what, how history is constructed is kind of utopian. Again, I'd put an asterisk over that, or I'd put scare quotes or whatever. But yeah, I kind of see it that way. Like it's a very unique opportunity. And for me, teaching is work. And, sometimes you think, oh, I have to teach a class. This is going to require labor and so on. But when you see students' enthusiasm for wrestling over these kinds of things, it really does feel that way, kind of quasi-utopian.
So I agree with a lot of that. I don't think that's cheesy. Cheesy. If it's cheesy, then I'm cheesy too. I borrowed this from, I think a lot of teaching is just like, my teaching is just like me stealing from other people that I've seen do cool things. And I start a lot of my classes with a chapter from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where Freire talks about that like banking model of education and how like there's this idea. I will talk to my students about this, and I'll say like, look at the way that this room is constructed. Like I'm standing up here by myself. There's like lights on me. I have a microphone, and you're all sitting out there. I can't even see your faces. So there's this immediate like asymmetry built into the geography of this room. Like the way that this is set up, I'm the sort of orator. I'm going to tell, and you're like going to sit there and you're going to absorb the information. But that's not actually how the world works. That's not actually how like knowledge gets produced and built, and that's not actually how it's also not like pedagogically very valuable. I mean, if you think about like how people learn, they learn by doing, they learn by talking to each other. So, I think in one sense, those like structures of the academy that you mentioned, or like the neoliberal structures of the academy, are really sticky because they're sort of like baked into the way, the physical classroom is built. They're baked into grading. They're baked into all these things that we sort of have to contend with. But one thing that I've sort of tried to do, first of all, is just to highlight them, just to say like, look, this is like maybe a way that we've all been like trained to think of like learning and knowledge, but again, this is just not the way it has to be. It's not the way it's always been. That's not the way it is everywhere. We can just sort of like think about it. Like that's like step one. But I also like one thing that's been really, I think, hard for me to do, but that I've really enjoyed sometimes not, is just like letting myself get sidetracked. So if I'm in the classroom and I have a plan, I have slides, I have something I want to talk about, I have things that I think are interesting about the text, I have like ideas I want to get across. Sometimes if I'm actually listening to the students and what they're saying, they don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about something else. And maybe sometimes I'll, bring it back to the course. But sometimes I like just to let myself wander off and see what they want to think about and like how to build knowledge with them, and sort of rather than being a like bearer of knowledge, being some kind of like a guide or, sort of helpful in a way of thinking about things. And it's really hard because it requires giving up control of the situation. But again, like that control being baked into the learning process, I think can be really stifling. So sometimes it does go really off the rails and nothing gets done. But I think that's like necessary for actually trying to do that well.
Yeah, and I'll just say that some of the most fun that I have in the classroom is when I do let myself go off paper. You might say, like, again, I'll just sort of, tell a personal story to as my contribution, but again, in this witch hunts course, I was talking about, how like we have all these sort of writings, and they tell us sort of what they certainly tell us what the elites thought and how elites thought that the community should be structured. But the fact that they have to continue having that they have to continually present these messages tells us that maybe things weren't sort of progressing on the ground and among the common people like they thought they should. So that's how we sort of read against the grain of some of these sources. And then I bring up the James Brundage, who's this medieval historian. He has a medieval sex flow chart, which he goes through all these penitentials from like the 300s to the 1200s, or 300s to the 1100s perhaps, and he puts together this medieval flow chart Whereas if you're a medieval person and you want to have sex, these are the questions. These are the questions that you have to answer yes to, and it's hilarious. And I encourage you to look it up, because I had great fun this semester, because I realized it was a whole new generation of students who I hadn't introduced this to. So I pulled it up on the screen, and I was sort of like, there's like all of these questions, and they're like, well, when did they ever have sex? And I'm like, well, this is the lesson, is that people are not listening to these penitentials, and that you can have all these rules, and you can write them down year after year and in volume after volume, but what that tells us is that people are just doing it when they want to.
I love that. I think we've got time for one more question, if anybody has one.
Hi. I was wondering if you brought up earlier about like Canada, the idea of Canada being in a post-nationalist state, just as a concept. I was wondering if there's any connection between identity, like the bifurcation of identity happening, and nationalism and the post-nationalism, if that makes sense. Like the loss of consensus reality, and just the relationship between identity and nationalism in that way, and the kind of it becoming more and more complex. And
thanks. I mean, that's a big question. I think there's lots of connections there. I think it's Justin Trudeau who made that comment that said, when he was maybe early days of being a prime minister, he said Canada's the first post-national state. Okay, yeah. And it was this great moment of, international trade and globalization, and who needs nations anyways, what's the point of it? And then things have obviously changed in the subsequent years. Right. And I mean, that's why, I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but for me, that's why I think looking back to what Canadian literature was doing in terms of identity is really interesting to thinking about that. If there's one through line about Canadian literature and Canadian literary criticism, it's that we have this great literature / nation that's not being adequately represented in the literature, which is going back to 1820. People were saying that, and they were saying it last week probably. So that's very common. But then if you look, for example, at a writer like Hugh MacLennan, who was writing about the Halifax explosion, and his famous book Two Solitudes, about the Quebec English, the French-English divide in Quebec. He's wrestling with many of the same questions that we're wrestling with today. Obviously, we would find his answers kind of absurd in a lot of ways, but these are the same kinds of questions about what Canada is and how the nation works. And yeah, he's thinking along very similar lines. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay, thank you so much. So I want to thank everybody who's here. I want to thank the audience for those excellent questions. Those were very thought-provoking questions. I want to thank Jamie and her team who put this together, and the team of techs who've been running the mics and so on. And I particularly want to thank the panel. This was thought-provoking. This was rich. This was a great discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and for sharing your thoughts and anecdotes and little plugs for the University of Guelph, which I really appreciate. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.